Good evening, everyone. Um, Welcome to the Stormwater Master Plan public meeting for the Monte-Sano and Devil Swamp Watershed. We really appreciate you taking the time out this evening to join us as we have a lot of stuff to share, and we want to get right into it. I'm Claire Pittman. I work with Franklin Associates, and I'm part of the public engagement team. The project team this evening is going to go through a quick presentation. Then we will open it up to your questions and comments. So there's two things I want to point out. To enlarge your screen, there is going to be a little segmented box down in the lower right-hand corner. It's next to the YouTube logo. So if you point your cursor over the video that's streaming to you right now, you just click that little segmented box and it will enlarge the presentation and the video. When it's time for questions and comments, we will use the join the podium button. So in order to get to that button again, you're going to reduce the screen which you enlarge. So just click that segmented box and it will shrink the screen, and you'll see the join the podium button, which you are seeing right now on the slide. And that's where you will be able to ask us your questions and comments. And again, we are tracking all of this. So the reason this system is in use is so we can keep track of all your comments and questions. So that covers how to ask a question and how we're gonna run this thing. The last 30 minutes will be question and answer. So I'd like to hand the mic to Melissa Kennedy, who is the project manager and our fearless leader.
Thanks, Claire. Yes, as Claire said, I am the project manager for the Stormwater Master Plan. And before I get started, I just want to introduce the team members that are with us this evening. We have Jeff Dowdrick, who is our lead technical engineer. We have Stuart Berry, who is the lead modeler on this watershed and is going to present modeling results to you tonight. We have Devin Foyle, who is a certified floodplain manager with HNTB. He's going to give you an overview of the watershed. We also have Darby Cressy. She is another modeler that worked on this watershed. And we have Brandon Campo from CSRS, who's going to discuss policies and codes and ordinances. So with the Stormwater Master Plan, what are we trying to do? We're trying to identify the flood-related risk and vulnerabilities. And what does that mean? We're going to be able to identify where the flooding occurs, the depth that it occurs, and the resulting damages as a result of that flooding for various storm events. Then we're going to try and develop solutions and projects that is going to mitigate those flood risks. And those could be a number of things, and we'll talk about those later on in the presentation. Then in addition to projects, we are also going to implement some policy solutions to reduce flood risk. And most of those are going to be related to the development in the floodplain. Policy solutions and development of floodplain codes and ordinances revisions are going to help mitigate the future flood risk, whereas the projects that we're going to be identifying, we want to use those to address the current flood risk. And again, our focus is on the mitigation of damages over the entire parish and not necessarily individual properties, but we are hoping that through the plan that we will be able to reduce the flood risk for everyone. Now I'm going to turn it over to Devin Foyle, and he's going to give you background on the Monte-Sano watershed specifically. Devin?
Thank you, Melissa. I'm Devin Foyle, a planner with HNTB on the project team. Like Melissa said, I'm a certified floodplain manager, and I'm just going to briefly run through the overview of some of the drainage system things here. So first of all, this is a slide of the watersheds within the East Baton Rouge Parish. What is a watershed? It's an area of land that drains rainfall to a common outlet. And land topography has a big influence on how water drains within that watershed. So the Stormwater Master Plan divided the parish into 11 different watersheds to better evaluate flood risk. And today we're talking about the Monte-Sano watershed. As you can see, it's popping out there in that brownish color. The major roads that are kind of going in it that you can see is like I-110, US 190, US 19. Those are just there to help you kind of orient yourself as to where you are. But let's go a little bit deeper into it. So this map is depicting LIDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging. Basically, it's just a fancy way of saying a high-tech method for showing elevation. So we have LIDAR for the entire parish, and we're focusing on this watershed. And so the color differences here are important to note. The yellow and red colors are the high ground, while the blue and green colors are the lower elevations terrain. And again, the topography and terrain elevation, they're major influences on how water drains in a watershed. And so with that in mind, this watershed is a bit different than the other watersheds in the parish. It's not a part of the Comeet-Amite River Basin. Its streams are not tributaries to those rivers, so it's not really affected much by what happens in that basin. In this watershed, in the Monte-Sano watershed, water mostly drains west to the Mississippi River. And so that's something unique and something to keep in mind during the rest of this presentation. But as we look at this map, so it's important to note the low areas. Of course, the Mississippi River is the lowest area, and then the swamp out to the west there, the wetland area, very, very low, but also Monte-Sano Bayou itself. Makes a semicircle around I-10 there, goes out to the Mississippi, very low. And then you can also see Hurricane Creek up in that area. There's an interconnection between Monte-Sano Bayou and Hurricane Creek. So our modelers are going to go into that a little bit more. But then, yeah, towards the south area there, there's also a low area in the watershed. And we'll see that in some of our model demonstrations, but it's something to keep in mind, those low elevations there. So this slide shows the FEMA special flood hazard areas. The blue shaded areas are the FEMA designated 100-year flood zones. So that means that an area that has a 1% chance of being inundated by a flood event in any given year. It does not, 100-year does not mean once every 100 years. It just means 1% chance of flooding in any given year. And so that means that over the course of a 30-year mortgage, there's around a 30% chance of being flooded. But as you can see, these flood zones correspond to those low elevations that are close to the river and close to the channels like Monte-Sano Bayou that we were looking at. So out in the wetlands there, the Mississippi River, around the bayou. And then you can see that the floodplain also extends over to Hurricane Creek, like we were saying. And then it's important to notice down in the south area where there were some low elevations, that's not necessarily a 100-year flood zone. So it doesn't necessarily correspond with the low areas that we saw. So the flood maps might not be accurate representation of risk in that area. And again, our models will show why that is a little later in this presentation. But again, something to keep in mind. So this map is a map of the drainage system within the watershed. The blue line segments are the streams and channels, while the white dots are the stormwater structures that indicate subsurface system. When I say subsurface, I mean the underground pipe system. And so at the beginning of the Stormwater Master Plan, the project team underwent a very extensive data collection effort. And why collect a lot of data? Well, that's because you can't really fix what you don't know about, right? So we need to know as much as we can. And some of that data you can see here, there was over 350 miles of channels surveyed. So again, those blue line segments. Over 800 bridges and culverts were inspected, over 67,000 of those structures were examined. So those white dots, over 67,000 parish-wide were examined and put into a GIS database and then given to the parish. So you can kind of see a blank spot of no structures in an area in that map. Those are just private industrial areas, private systems, so we didn't have data on those. But that's just an overview of the drainage system right there, and you can kind of see the development that's taking place in those areas. So some of the data that we also got that we obtained was data from residents. Residents provided photo submissions and information on flooding issues through our project email and on social media. And some of the pictures shown here are just a sample of what we received. And I have to say a special thank you and shout out to Miss Angela White for sending us so much information and feedback. It's really helped us with our overall evaluation of the watershed. So thank you, Ms. White. That's very great. And hopefully we can answer all your questions tonight. But these are some of the themes of the submissions that we got: maintenance issues and surface and subsurface systems. There's some impacts to communications infrastructures with flooding and street flooding during heavy rains. And so all of this info, like I said, helps our modeling team verify problem areas in the models and helps evaluate the flood risk there. Go to the next slide. So this map is a map. It's a composite of different kinds of data points. So it has data of repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss areas, 311 calls and submissions, and resident photo and email submissions, that some of those that you just saw there. And so on this map, you can kind of see that each red star represents one of those. And you can see that the red stars are clustered around the low elevations, close to the bayou, and down in the lakes area. Those low elevations and those flood zones that we saw, they're kind of clustered in those areas. But there are also some clustered in the subsurface system areas, the enclosed drainage system areas, those white dot areas that we saw. And we're going to go over those in more detail later in the presentation as well. But that's just kind of an overall look at what you're dealing with in this watershed in terms of drainage and things like that. And I'm just going to hand it back over to Melissa.
Forget about the muting. Thanks, Devin. I'm going to cover an overview of the modeling approach. And then Stuart's going to go into details about the specific modeling related to this watershed. So we basically have 3 levels of modeling, and that correlates to 3 different types of models. We have a tier 1, what we call a regional model, and that covers a very large area. And what we use that model for is regional flood mapping and for planning purposes for the larger regional area and coming up with solutions. Tier 2 is a watershed level model, and that correlates to what you see in this picture on the right. This happens to be an image of the clay cut watershed outlined in black, and we have a specific model for each of the watersheds, including Monte-Sano Bayou. And then we have what we call a tier 3 level model, and that is a higher resolution model, gives more detailed, and we can utilize that model for planning and design. And I'd like to focus your attention on the red box because I'm going to talk about, show you the different, how the model looks for each of those different tier evaluations. But first, I want to just talk about this slide and show you the extent of the regional model. And as you can see, it's a very large area. It's greater than the parish area. It covers into other parishes. But I also want to point out that the green area shows the EBR parish, and each of those green lines inside there show those watersheds and the watershed level model. So the red area is one large model, and then there is a separate model for each of those green areas. And then that tier 3, there are separate models in each of those green areas for the tier 3, but it's too tiny to try and show you in this image. But here on this slide, this shows kind of an image of what the model looks like for each of these tiers. The tier 1, again, has kind of a grid spacing of the topography, covers a much larger area. It includes major streams and only major structures. And this model really is used to evaluate those longer duration rain events over large areas, such as the 2016 flood and the May 2021 flood. And again, we use that to evaluate larger regional solutions. An example of that would be like the Comeet River Diversion Project. The Tier 2 model, again, this is a more detailed resolution. You can see that by the tighter grid spacing. And we include all of the streams and all of the major crossings, as well as a lot of the other structure crossings. And again, this model is utilized for the watershed kind of neighborhood planning level design. And we evaluate the 24-hour duration storm of many different rainfall events. And the third tier is that much more detailed level modeling. And these are much smaller areas. And what we're essentially evaluating with these are the subsurface system. So we get into a more detailed analysis, and we can actually evaluate what goes on at the street level. And these models are used to evaluate those shorter duration, higher intensity storms. And now I'm going to turn it over to Stuart, who's going to talk about more details related to the Monte-Sano watershed and the modeling.
Hi, as I said, I'm Stuart. I'm going to talk about some modeling results. This first slide here is kind of an overview of our Tier 2 modeling results. So what we're showing here is we're going to show an animation of a rainfall event. This is the 13-inch 24-hour rainfall event. That's equivalent to about a 100-year rainfall event. So as you can see, it kind of goes quickly, but you can see it kind of building up, flooding kind of quickly, then receding very slowly. But this is for the overall basin. You can see these 4 locations here. We're going to show you kind of some detailed, we're going to zoom in on these 4 locations and show you some more detailed results. Next slide. This first one is going to show you some Tier 2 results of an area near Capitol Lake. To get your bearings, this is in the southern end of the Monte-Sano Basin. You can see on the southwest side of the screen, you can kind of see the State House. That's I-110 kind of zigzagging through the property, the area. The Mississippi is that, western area over there to the west. So Capitol Lake is a kind of man-made lake that collects rainfall runoff and then is protected by a levee on the western end and then discharges into the Mississippi River at 2 locations. Its primary outfall is a culvert. So it drains out just by gravity into the Mississippi River, but it also has a pump station that it can help assist it drain out. There are a couple, the culvert is low enough that either once every year or for likely every year, sometimes every other year or so, the Mississippi River can be high enough to actually be above the culvert outlet. If in those situations, the pump station is the only way to flow out. So this animation here is a scenario in which we're assuming that the Mississippi River is high, which means that the culvert outlet is not working. And then the only outlet for Capitol Lake is the pump station. In that case, and we're running a 13-inch 24-hour storm, which is approximately a 100-year storm. As you can see during the animation, I think it was, oh yeah. So these next 2 slides are going to kind of show what the risk is, or kind of this area. So this first slide is showing flooding during the 100-year scenario, the 13-inch 24-hour storm when the Mississippi River is low. So as you can see right here, there's some flooding. This is the neighborhood southeast of Capitol Lake. These kind of flow areas are showing the water flowing kind of quickly. You do see some flood depth, but the flood depth is kind of shallow here. And generally water is moving quickly towards Capitol Lake and then out into the Mississippi River. If you go to the next slide. This slide is showing a different scenario. Same rainfall event. So same thing happening in the area, but the Mississippi River is high. So the only way for water to flow out of Capitol Lake is through the pump station. So in this case, you can tell these flow arrows are not moving as quickly. Water is kind of stagnating. You may not be able to tell, but it's also actually a little bit deeper in this scenario than it would be otherwise. And because water can only get out through the pump station, it's getting deeper and then backing up. And actually there's a potential for it to flow backwards into Dawson Creek, which contributes to Ward Creek and then to the Comey River. So what we're planning on doing in these areas is, because there's this risk of this happening, doesn't necessarily mean that it's happened or that it will happen, but there is a risk. We're going to perform a kind of assessment of the outfall structures for Capitol Lake to assess whether or not their operations need to be changed or whether or not they need to be upgraded at all, just to make sure that to reduce the risk and make sure the risk is maintained. Okay, the next 3 slides are going to be showing you some Tier 3 modeling results. So as Melissa said before, these Tier 3 modeling results are kind of assessing the subsurface drainage structures. So this first one is in the Southern Heights Woodare area. So I know that area to the north right there at 78th and Pembroke was actually one of the areas mentioned to us, and we had some photos for. So those were helpful when we were trying to calibrate or validate the model. But these are, I'll just point out, each of these maps will kind of look like this. You can see the pipe networks in here. The blue areas are showing the 100-year floodplain depths. And then all of the other dots are showing simulated flooding of houses. So the red dots will be indicating areas that are much more flood prone, could flood approximately every year or have a risk of flooding every year. And then when you get up to the orange, then the yellow, then the green dots, it's less flood prone. So the green ones will be every 200 years, yellow 100 years, and the orange will be every 10 years. So you can see the area to the north has more of looks like it needs to have some improvements to its storm drain infrastructure, potentially culverts. So that's what we're going to be looking into. The area to the south is potentially some storm drain infrastructure, but also because it's discharging into a larger stream there with culverts, we're going to also have to assess the capacity of the stream and culverts and things like that. So improvements to this area that we'll be analyzing will be basically conveyance improvements, such as storm drain infrastructure, ditches, pipes, and things like that. This area is, so same thing, the legend will show the same kind of thing. This is up in Scotlandville. So as a point of reference, that's Scotland Avenue, Scenic Highway. Southern University is just to the west, kind of off the screen. But this area is an area that has kind of the area between Scenic Highway and Scotland Avenue doesn't have a lot of storm drain infrastructure in that area that's flooding. So it's an area that we're going to be looking at improving the localized conveyance systems. So either piping or improved ditches and culverts. And also for this area, anything east of Scenic Highway is kind of flowing east towards Scotland, and it is being constricted by a culvert under Scotland Avenue and the railroad. Everything west of Scenic Highway is flowing towards a culvert going under Kingfisher and the railroad. So it's being also constricted by that culvert and potentially by the stream down, on the west of Kingfisher and the railroad. So we'll look at potentially upsizing the culverts at those locations and also improving storm drain infrastructure in the area. This area is north of that Scotlandville area. That's Blunt Road, kind of the north side of your screen, and Scotland Avenue. I-110 is just below this area. And the airport is, maybe half a mile or so to the east of this location. But this area, it looks like the storm drain infrastructure is not that bad west of Scotlandville. The issue is the outlet under Scotlandville. Is what it seems to be. It seems to be that there's the culverts aren't big enough. Maybe some of the feeder pipes aren't large enough. And also maybe there's constriction in the channel downstream. So that's what we're going to look at to see if we need to increase conveyance capacity of any of these storm sewer systems, but also possibly replacing the pipes under that railroad and Scotland. So in general, our overall analysis kind of had these overall findings. As was mentioned before, this watershed is not sensitive to the Amite and Comite River flooding. It's a tributary to the Mississippi River. So parts of the watershed could be sensitive to the levels of the Mississippi River. The southern drainage area is dependent on a pump station. So that's the area contributing to Capitol Lake near the Capitol building. So we'll look at potentially assessing operations of that pump station improvements. I think as Devin mentioned previously, there's also a interconnection between Hurricane Creek watershed, which is a tributary to Comite Amite and Monte-Sano Bayou. So we're going to look at, potentially doing some kind of control structure possibly between that connection, just potentially. Also at Capitol Lake, there is a potential for overflow. If the pump station is the only thing pumping and there's flooding in that neighborhood to the southeast of Capitol Lake, there is a potential for overflow flooding from Capitol Lake Basin into Ward Creek, which would be maybe Dawson Creek, which flows into Ward Creek and then under the Comite Amite area. Through all the data we analyzed, we noticed, clearly maintenance is critical and a concern here. A lot of these pipes just need to be maintained. All these ditches, pipes, dry culverts, all those things. Mixed drainage system areas. You can see a picture of what that example is to the top right. Mixed drainage system areas. When we say that, we're referencing areas that have open ditching, pipes and culverts, sometimes feeding into storm sewer. So something like that. Those areas have a lot more maintenance issue than curb and gutter, just because they can fill in with sediment so easily and they're not well maintained. And we also noticed a location of erosion at Monte-Sano outfall. You can see that in the bottom right picture. That's something we'll analyze also to make sure that there's not an erosion issue. So this map here is showing kind of all the areas we identified as locations to assess and try to analyze for potential projects. Doesn't necessarily mean that we're kind of in the pre-stages of that right now. So, as I said before, we're going to look at a lot of enclosed system and overland flow conveyance improvements, like flow control structure potentially for Hurricane Creek and Monte-Sano, water level management at Capitol Lake, the stream bank stabilization for the erosion at Monte-Sano, and then potential culvert replacements kind of at various locations just to try to improve conveyance. I think at this point, I'm going to pass it over to Melissa.
Yep. Thank you, Stuart. So as Stuart said, maintenance is a concern, and we are aware of that. And what you're seeing on this slide is showing the results of our inspection of the subsurface system where there were sediments in the structures. So the color coding shows the different amounts of sediment that were identified in the various structures. Green, we identified 25 to 50% full of sediment, orange 50 to 75%, and red greater than 75% sediment. And I want to tell you that the parish is in the process of addressing these issues throughout the parish. They're using American Rescue Plan Act funds right now and are working through the parish to address this. So, and I remember, I think there was a next door post that so far there's been well over 1 million cubic yards of debris removed from sediments, and I forget how many structures have been already cleaned, but that is an ongoing effort. And that leads into what I want to talk to you about now, and all the approved projects and policies that are currently ongoing or have been approved to date for the overall stormwater master plan. Again, I talked about maintenance of the existing system. There's going to be 20 million more next year from the American Rescue Plan Act applied to addressing maintenance. That will continue for the subsurface cleaning of the system, as well as doing maintenance in the channels and roadside ditches. So that is going to be happening here soon. And then there were a number of hazard mitigation grant projects that have been approved by FEMA. And what you're seeing in the middle of your screen, this picture is an example of one of those projects in which there was a constriction at a bridge location, and we're recommending removal of the restriction, which will increase the flow. There are also a number of Louisiana Watershed Initiative projects that have been approved to date. And if you look on the lower right-hand corner of your screen, this is an area of floodplain preservation that has been identified as one of those projects. In addition, we've already identified some low impact development policies that have been approved. And this cross-section in your screen of the trees, that is a cross-section of proposed green infrastructure that has been recommended to be included in the development code as an option. So those are some of the things ongoing. And in addition, the parish is working on a home buyout program for repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss property. So to date, there has been over $96 million approved in funding, and all of that is 100% federal funding. So what you're seeing on this slide then is kind of a conglomeration of all of that work. This is just showing where these projects are throughout the parish at this point in time. And it also includes those projects that are being completed by the Corps of Engineers. We've got the Comeet River project up here. And then these tributary projects that the Corps is doing, that's going to be happening here very soon. They're going to be doing channel improvements, clearing, some riprap, and some channel widening in select locations. And in addition, the parish is going to be doing, again, as I said, maintenance, channel work, and subsurface system. So that is going to be happening here shortly. Trying to get there. So I want to turn it over now to Brandon Campo from CSRS, who's going to talk about the proposed policies and development codes work that has been done, is ongoing. Brandon?
Thanks, Melissa. Again, I'm Brandon Campo. I'm with CSRS Architects and Engineers. And part of our contribution to the Stormwater Master Plan is to examine existing and potential changes to the Unified Development Code. These are the rules that any development company, whether it's an engineering firm or something similar, has to follow if they're developing a site, such as a subdivision or a commercial site. So earlier in 2021, the parish approved, so these are things that we were able to do before the modeling phase of the Stormwater Master Plan. The parish approved a conveyance check. So drainage impact studies now have to include a conveyance check. And this will help ensure that a site wouldn't affect downstream flow. We were able to add green infrastructure prioritization to the UDC. So what that will basically do is encourage the use of green infrastructure during site development. And we also proposed some clarifications to Chapter 15 of the UDC, which is the chapter that focuses on drainage and floodplains. And we're especially focused on the items in the UDC that focus on development in the floodplain. And we just want to make it easier to understand in that section of Chapter 15. But moving forward, we're able to use the models like the one that Stuart presented earlier. We're able to use those to inform changes to the UDC. And this work is ongoing. So we're assessing the impact of raising the minimum slab elevation. So right now, anything has to be built, if it's in the floodplain, it has to be built to 1 foot above the base flood elevation. Another thing we're looking at is protecting natural floodplain features and floodplain preservation. So we'll be able to see what effect that has on drainage in the area. Also looking at fill requirements, specifically where fill can be placed and how high, and we're able to actually test how that affects the floodplain on a widespread scale. And we are also looking at specific requirements for new development. So in the past, we've set ordinances based on accepted engineering practice. And now what we'll be able to do is we'll use these models to assess the widespread impacts of developing in a particular way. And that helps us to recommend changes to the development code. And I think that's all we have. Melissa, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you again.
Thanks, Brandon. And last, I just want to go over briefly the schedule and where we are today. This is an overall schedule for the Stormwater Master Plan, and the red line in the middle is where we are right now. As you can see, our data collection is completed. We're finalizing this modeling assessment and the flood hazard assessment, and we're working on developing those projects and those codes and ordinances to reduce the flood risk. And then with the intent of wrapping everything up into a consolidated report later in July, in third quarter of 2022. And as part of that, we're also developing a capital improvement plan, whereby we have identified those projects. We will prioritize them, assign funding to them and a schedule, and that will be spread out through the 20 years. So that will be the 20-year capital improvement plan. And then the last thing is the public outreach, which is an ongoing effort throughout this whole program. So I'm going to turn it back over to Claire.
Thanks, Melissa. So this has been a lot of great information. And we want to get your comments and your questions and everything regarding this watershed. I want to remind you that you go to the Join the Podium. I'm going to go over the slide about contact us, but as I'm talking, you can go to Join the Podium and start putting your comments and questions in. Now, remember to reduce, if you enlarge the YouTube screen, to either to click the X or use the segmented box to reduce it so you can get to that Join the Podium button. So as Melissa said, public involvement, public feedback is critical to this program. And how you can submit that public feedback is either by emailing us at info@stormwater.brla.gov or visiting us at our website at stormwater.brla.gov or posting on social media. So we are on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and we check all of those avenues daily. And we'll get you back a question as soon as we can, as soon as we have a good answer for you. So again, the Join the Podium button is on the screen. You'll click that, you'll enter in your information, and then we will put it up and our panelists will answer it. I'd like to also give a shout out. Not only do we have our program team here, but we have members from the city, Fred Rayford, the Director of Transportation, and some of the members of his team. So please share with us the questions you may have. Right now, I'm going to hand it over to my moderator, Jonathan Hill, who's also public involvement team member, and he's going to help moderate our questions for this public meeting.
Will the Stormwater Master Plan include information to allow both the city and homeowner associations to proactively know drainage system conditions?
Fred, did you want to answer that? It's not necessarily a Stormwater Master Plan concern.
I didn't have the question, hear all the question. I'm sorry, Melissa.
Sure, I can repeat it. It asks, will the Stormwater Master Plan include information to allow both the city and homeowners associations to proactively know drainage system conditions?
Well, certainly that's going to be part of the overall plan that we want to deal with, because that's why we having this master plan to start with and having the public involvement to give us the details and things that they see on a day-to-day basis, particularly with the rainfall issues we're dealing with. certainly the city has always taken the position that we want to work with the property owners and the homeowners association to find out what those issues are, what they see, and then we would go in to look at evaluating what those conditions may be and what needs to be improved to help address or reduce the flood risk for those areas. So certainly the city is going to be involved in every process when it comes to drainage, and we look forward to dealing with that in the real near future.
I just want to add to that. So again, there is a database that has been developed of the system, and we are in discussions with the parish on what level they're going to allow the public to see that, as well as the maintenance of that. That has not been completely decided yet, but it will probably be similar to what you see with the sanitary system.
And Melissa, you're absolutely correct. There's some data that we have not truly finalized or evaluated yet at this point, and we're not going to provide that type of information because we want to be sure whatever we put out there, we can verify and back up from a data standpoint.
What happens to I-110 at Capitol Lakes during a 100-year flood?
I can answer that one. So, I think the important thing to note about there's two low spots there along 110 that the low spots, the elevation of those low spots are very close to the same elevation as Capitol Lake. And so when we have Capitol Lake back flooding, it can start to cause issues on 110. And if we get a very big event, that can spill into 110, into those low spots, and cause some of the back flooding there. I think that has been seen in the past. So the pumping only will go so far. If it's back flooded, it's just kind of circulating the pumping there. So we're still looking at and seeing what types of solutions that we can come up with in that area. So that's one that we are still continuing to kind of review and find a solution for.
And I do just want to add that there are pump stations for each of those low areas that the Department of Transportation, the State Department of Transportation operates and maintains. So just wanted to add that little bit.
Melissa, I want to comment also to that, just for clarification. Our maintenance division also has a plan that we look at when we are looking to address storm events. Now, certainly when it comes and just pounds up, that's one issue. But if we know that a major storm event or some type of rain event is headed our way, we also, we've asked the sewer department who handles the pumping at the Capitol Lake Station to drop that level of the water at Capitol Lake as much as a foot to 2 foot to allow for the retention and the pumping of water into that facility. We have that plan. That's something that Mr. Hill, Kelvin Hill, who is our Assistant Chief Administrative Officer, has asked us to put together, and we follow that on a weekly basis, depending on what type of events we have. But certainly we take the steps to be proactive and not necessarily always reactive.
Hey, Melissa, I wanted to add something to that too. Rachel Lambert, Director of Development. I know that DOTD actually has spent the past year or two upgrading both of those pump stations that pump out the I-110 right there, but they're still going to be restricted to an extent by the conveyance capacity to the pump stations themselves. So there is a design life, and it is a DOTD pipes and infrastructure and whatnot, but like they've said, that we're working with trying to figure out the best operating scheme for the Capitol Lake so that we don't hamper the ability of those pump stations during high rain events.
Thank you all. There are several areas that need subsurface and covert development. The only project listed is Hurricane Creek Slope. What is the timing for subsurface, drainage, and covert needs?
Well, I'm just going to start off saying, well, that's what we're looking at right now. As Stuart identified, there are areas that have are basically ditches and driveway culverts. And it's not necessarily that that's bad. It's just that they're not maintained. So those need to be cleaned out, cleared out. And then other maybe upstream, downstream culverts also potentially revised. The intent is not necessarily to install a new subsurface system, but certainly if something is needed, we will be looking at that. And I guess I'm confused on why just Hurricane Creek. It will not be just Hurricane Creek. It will be throughout the watershed. I don't, Jeff.
Can I add to that? Yeah, I think maybe what the reference there is to the project map that you showed, Melissa. There's the number 2 that indicates the Hurricane Creek slope paving project at Plank Road. So those are projects that were kind of part of the beginning of this whole process that were kind of the low-hanging fruit or some of the maintenance issue in terms of larger flooding problems that were addressed at the very beginning of the project that we didn't necessarily have to have kind of modeling and all this additional survey and data for. As we go through this process, part of what we're doing is trying to understand where that additional risk is, and we will find those areas as we go through that process. And so I don't know, Melissa, if you want to add anything there. I just want to maybe mention that as part of the process, we look at where the risk is, and we're developing those projects right now. When it comes to when they would actually occur, it's really has to do with the possibility of where the funding comes from, how much risk is actually in each of those areas. I don't know if you want to touch base on that a little bit more, Melissa.
Yeah. So we're looking. We're doing what we're calling a funding plan. So we're looking at all sorts of sources for funding. We know there's American Rescue Act funds coming. There's more Louisiana Watershed Initiative funds. There is a new state water sector commission established. We know there's going to be funds coming from the infrastructure bill. So we're watching all of those and monitoring those so that as we identify projects and those sources become available, we're prepared to apply for them because we'll have these projects ready. I just can't tell anybody at this point in time which projects when. We haven't finished our analysis to come up with the entire list of projects and our prioritization of those projects. So that is a little bit down the road yet. But the intent is to, as I said, all those eligible projects to be put into a 20-year capital improvement plan.
How does the UDC positively impact smaller scale developments in established neighborhoods that can impact flooding, especially given the issues shown in the modeling today?
Can you say that? Can you repeat that one?
Sure. How does the UDC positively impact smaller scale developments in established neighborhoods that can impact flooding, especially given the issues shown in the modeling today?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question, so I'm going to give it a shot. And if anyone else has a better understanding, please jump in. I think you're referring to like infill development on areas that have property available in places where individual or smaller developments could be placed. In areas where flooding, the UDC has requirements on the drainage design as well as the elevation that those structures can be built to in terms of first floor elevation above the base flood elevation. We're evaluating that right now to see if we think that's an adequate measure or if it should be higher. I don't know. Brandon, did you have anything to add to that one? I'm still not quite sure I understood it 100%.
Yeah, I think the question is kind of going along the lines of how does the UDC affect subdivisions and small developments that are already in place? And specifically, how does it positively impact those? And I don't think that the UDC itself is a tool we can use to necessarily reduce existing flooding. That's just not something the UDC is capable of. But what it will do is, at least our goal with it, is to try and make sure that future development does not increase flood levels in our parish. So in that way, it's a prevented negative impact to existing subdivisions, if that makes sense.
And this is Ryan with the Planning Commission. I would just add, the Planning Commission has updated the Unified Development Code throughout the years. There's been a series of changes and updates since the 2016 event. There's been about 15 to 20 UDC amendments throughout the UDC, adding required open space and developments, low impact developments, updating Chapter 15. Melissa touched on that in the group earlier. There's also a requirement for no adverse impact development that's required for all developments, including infill.
I could probably expand on some of that too, Melissa. Rachel Lambert, Director of Development. Infill developments and redevelopment in itself is always, encouraged. We always want to be renewing ourselves and, keeping our city awesome. But, and we're very cognizant with infill type developments to make sure that they're not, exceeding existing infrastructure's capabilities. We do lean heavily on the conveyance check requirements and the no adverse impact requirements that are in the UDC to even sometimes identify potential bottlenecks or weak points, we'll call it, in some of the design, of the infrastructure that's already there, so that we can, try to work with the developers in conjunction with the parish and try to, solve some of those problems in themselves.
Thank you all. Given climate change and the new volume of rainfall in recent storms, are there any potential failures in our current drainage system within this watershed?
I'm not sure if failures is the right word. I guess the question is, are we meeting, or how is the system working in relation to all this to the additional rainfall and events that we're seeing? And I would say that there are for sure issues. And we are evaluating and looking at, when we do projects and solutions, we're looking at the future condition. In other words, a 13-inch rainfall today for the 100-year may not be the same as for 50 years from now. It could be 14 inches 15 years from now. I don't know the exact numbers that we're utilizing, but we are evaluating those conditions. I don't know, Jeff, did you want to add anything to that?
No, yeah, I think that the difference is, what are the current problems related to the current climate, and then what is the potential for additional future risk or additional risk in the future. And yes, we are taking a look at that as part of when we develop a project. What is the resiliency of that project? Taking a look at both the existing condition as well as how would a project fare if we do get additional rainfall in the future. So we do account for it that way when we're looking at each of these projects. But in terms of climate change associated with existing problems, I don't think we're looking at that specifically.
So we are coming to the last few questions. If there is anyone out there who has not clicked join the podium and entered your question or comment, please do that right now. We have about 5 more minutes left of the meeting, and we really would love to hear from you. So click that join the podium and enter your information in, and we will get it addressed. Jonathan?
Is there a certain level of maintenance that should be executed to ensure that the bayou is operating effectively?
So there should be regular maintenance. I don't know that I can tell you exactly what that is. I would imagine the parish maintenance folks have a better understanding of how often maintenance is required. But that is true that it does need to be maintained. And as part of the stormwater master plan and the parish meeting their MS4 permit, they will need to have a maintenance program in place, not only for the subsurface system, but for the channels as well. So that is part of the program and it is being looked at right now. So that will be included.
Are there any regulations that govern the upkeep for retention ponds and HOAs?
I am going to defer to Rachel and Ryan.
There are some regulations in Chapter 15 regarding the upkeep of, maintenance of ponds. And the Department of Development, is tasked with enforcing those requirements. And we're working together with Melissa and her team on shoring them up to make sure that, everyone is equally maintaining their ponds and their other stormwater and storage, features, and also, trying to work to find ways to, assist communities and neighborhood associations and of the sorts in knowing, what to do and how to do it, and, all those good things that come along with that.
All righty. Well, I think that is the last of our questions that have been submitted either through the Join the Podium or email or some other ways people have submitted questions. We have asked those during this public meeting. So I would like to thank everyone who attended, as well as all of our team members from the project team and the members of the city that joined us today. We also had some council members in attendance, so we'd like to thank them for attending. And one more time, we are collecting your feedback, comments, questions via our email address at info@stormwater.brla.gov. We also are checking social media, so you can post pictures and utilize that hashtag EBR Stormwater. And then finally, we are accepting all of those things through our website at stormwater.brla.gov. So again, thank you for attending, and thanks to all the team for coming out tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good job, guys.
Yeah.